She wore a dead woman's name to walk down that aisle. She carried another man's child beneath her wedding gown. And when the Duke took her hand at the altar and whispered, "At last, Alara," she wanted to scream that Alara was already 6 months in a grave in Lisbon, and she, Josephine Hale, was the ghost wearing her skin. Welcome back to Charlotte's Title Whispers. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. And if you haven't yet, subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of this story. Now settle in. Chapter 1. London, 1861. The fog came in thick off the Thames that morning, the kind that swallowed carriage wheels whole and made the gas lamps look like dying stars. Josephine Hale stood before the looking-glass in the front bedroom of a townhouse that was not hers, wearing a name that was not hers, and did not recognize the woman staring back. Lady Alara Fenwick. That was who she was now. Had been for 11 months. The real Alara had died of fever in a rented room above a chandler's shop in Lisbon, 3 days after her ship had been meant to sail home. Josephine had been her companion then, hired to fetch her tea and mend her hems and listen to her complain about the Duke she'd never met but was promised to. Nobody in Lisbon had known Alara well enough to grieve her properly. Nobody in London had seen her since she was a girl of 12, before her family shipped her off to a convent school and then later, to whatever finishing existed for young ladies who'd grown too willful for their own good. So when the fever took her, and the letters from the Duke's solicitor kept arriving, addressed to Lady Alara Fenwick, expecting Lady Alara Fenwick, Josephine had done the only thing she could think to do. She had answered them. She smoothed her gloves now, hands trembling in a way she hoped no one would notice. Behind her, the housemaid, a sharp-eyed girl named Peg who asked too many questions and answered too few, fussed with the hem of her traveling dress. "You're pale as milk, my lady," Peg said. "I am only tired," Josephine answered, and it wasn't entirely a lie. She hadn't slept properly in weeks. Not since she'd understood what was growing inside her, since she'd counted the months on her fingers in the dark and understood, with a cold drop in her stomach, exactly whose child this was, and exactly how little time she had left to hide it. She had not asked for this. Not the borrowed name, not the child, not any of it. She had only wanted to survive a night in a stranger's carriage that had gone wrong in ways she still could not speak of aloud, even to herself. Lord Ambrose Vane had smiled at her the way gentlemen smile at companions who have no one to protect them, and by the time she understood his intentions it had been too late to do anything but endure it. She had told no one. Who would have believed her? A lady's companion, penniless, against the word of an earl's son. She had simply left. Boarded a ship. Buried herself in another woman's grave, and let a dead girl's engagement become her only shelter from the wreckage of what had happened to her. Now that shelter had a roof that leaked. The carriage that would take her to Ravenska Hall was already waiting below, its lacquered black doors bearing a crest she'd only ever seen pressed into wax. She had met the Duke exactly once before this. A brief, formal introduction 3 weeks prior, conducted in a drawing room with her stepmother's letters of introduction laid out like evidence at trial. He had been courteous, distant. A tall man with a scar through one eyebrow and eyes the color of wet slate, who had looked at her the way a man looks at a ledger he has not yet had time to audit. He had not touched her. Had barely spoken beyond what propriety demanded. And yet she had felt in that hour the particular discomfort of being seen, as if he were cataloguing her, weighing her against some private measure she could not guess at. She feared what he might see now with more time. "My lady." Peg's voice, softer now. "Forgive my asking. But you've not been yourself. Not since Portugal." Josephine's hand went, without her permission, to the place just below her ribs where the truth was hiding, still small enough to conceal beneath good tailoring and looser stays, but not for much longer. Perhaps 8 weeks. Perhaps less if the dressmaker's eye was sharper than she hoped. "I am only nervous for my wedding," she said. As any bride would be. Peg did not look convinced. But Peg was a servant, and servants who valued their positions learned not to press. Outside, the coachman called that they were ready. Josephine drew in one long breath, the kind she'd learned these past months to use like armor, and descended the stairs of a house she'd never truly lived in, toward a marriage built on a name that wasn't hers, to a man who did not yet know he was about to bind himself to a stranger. She told herself as the carriage door closed behind her and the fog swallowed the street whole, that she only needed to survive the wedding. After that, after the ring, after the vows, after her place was secured beyond question, she could find some way someday to make peace with the lie. She did not yet know that the Duke of Ravenska had already begun asking quiet questions in Lisbon. She did not yet know that by the time the wedding gown was fitted for the final time, the seams would no longer be the only thing straining to hold. Ravenska Hall rose out of the fog like something remembered rather than seen, grey stone, ivy gone brittle with autumn, windows lit gold against a sky the colour of a bruise. Josephine had visited twice since her arrival in London, both times for tea taken in stiff silence, both times feeling as though she were being measured for a coffin rather than a wedding dress. This time Julian Ashworth, Duke of Ravenska, was waiting for her at the top of the steps himself, without footmen to soften the moment. That she had learned already was unlike him. He did not do things without reason. Lady Alara. He offered his arm. His voice was even, but there was something beneath it tonight. A carefulness that hadn't been there before, like a man walking across ice he suspected might not hold. I hoped we might speak before the dressmaker arrives. Her stomach dropped the way it did on the top stair when her foot found nothing where a step should be. Of course, Your Grace. He led her not to the drawing room but to his study, a room she had never been permitted into before, all dark wood and the smell of pipe tobacco and old paper. He shut the door himself. She noted that too. No maid to overhear. I had a letter, he said, from a solicitor in Lisbon. The fire cracked in the grate. Josephine kept her hands folded before her, the way a lady's companion learns to hold herself when a room turns dangerous. Still, small, unremarkable, praying to be overlooked. An inheritance matter, he continued, watching her face the way he had that very first day, cataloguing. Nothing of consequence. Except that the solicitor mentioned, in passing, the name of the physician who attended you during your fever there. I confess I wrote to him. Out of a husband's concern for his future wife's health. The floor did not move. The room did not tilt. And yet Josephine felt quite distinctly as though she were falling. He described a woman, Julian said, fair-haired, slight, English. He described her illness in some detail. And then he described her death. Silence. The fire cracked again. I do not think, he said quietly, that I am marrying the woman that physician described. Josephine's breath had gone somewhere she could not find it. She thought, absurdly, of Peg's hands smoothing her hem that morning, of the fog swallowing the carriage, of how she had told herself she only needed to survive the wedding. She had not accounted for surviving this. Your Grace. Do not. His voice was not unkind, but it was final. Do not give me another lie to untangle. I have had a fortnight to sit with this. I would rather have the truth, however ugly, than one more borrowed sentence. She looked at him then, truly looked the way she had been too frightened to before, and saw not fury as she had braced for, but something more exhausting, patience. He had the look of a man who had already decided to be disappointed, and was simply waiting to learn the shape of it. So she told him. She told him of Alara's fever, of the chandler's rented room, of the letters that kept arriving for a dead woman. She told him of the convent school, of a family who would not have known Alara Fenwick's face if she'd walked past them in Bond Street. She told him, in a voice that did not once rise above the crackle of the fire, that she had done it because the alternative had been a debtor's grave of her own, nameless, penniless, a companion with nowhere left to be a companion to. What she did not tell him, could not yet make her mouth form, was the other thing. The thing growing beneath her stays, beneath the lie, beneath everything. Julian was quiet for a long moment after she finished. He had moved at some point in her confession to the window, his back to her, one hand braced against the frame as though the news required something solid to hold on to. An impostor, he said finally, testing the word like a stone in his shoe. In my house. In my name. I never meant to deceive you into affection, Your Grace. Only into a signature. Her voice cracked on the last word and she hated herself for it. You have never once looked at me as though you loved me. I told myself the wound would be smaller. He turned. And for the first time since she'd known him, something moved behind that slate-gray stillness. Not tenderness, not yet, but the first crack in a wall she hadn't known was load-bearing. You are wrong about one thing, he said. I have looked at you. More than I intended to. The air between them changed, thinned somehow the way it does before a storm breaks. He crossed the room slowly and she did not step back, though every instinct born of Lord Ambrose's carriage screamed at her too. This was different. She felt it in the careful distance he kept, in the way his hand lifted and then stopped, inches from her jaw, waiting, asking without asking, for permission she had not yet decided whether to give. Josephine, he said. Her true name in his mouth for the first time. It undid something in her chest she hadn't known was still tied shut. I ought to hate you, he murmured, close enough now that she could feel the warmth of his breath, could see the scar through his eyebrow catch the firelight. I find to my own considerable irritation that I do not. Her heart beat so loudly she was certain he could hear it. His thumb grazed, just barely, the line of her cheek, and she leaned, despite herself, despite the lie still coiled between them, a fraction of an inch into his palm. Then footsteps in the corridor. The dressmaker, arriving on schedule, oblivious to the ruin unfolding 20 feet away. Julian stepped back first. His hand fell away. Whatever had almost happened folded itself back into the careful distance of before. We will speak again tonight, he said, voice restored to its formal register, though his eyes had not entirely followed. After the fitting. Josephine curtsied because it was the only thing her body remembered how to do and left him standing by the fire. The truth finally spoken, the wound finally open, and the deeper truth, the one that would change everything again, still folded silent beneath her ribs. Chapter 3. The fitting room at Ravenska Hall had been a nursery once, long ago, before whatever grief had emptied it of children and filled it instead with dress forms and bolts of silk. Josephine stood upon the little wooden stool in her shift while Madame Lucille Perrault, a Frenchwoman with pins between her lips and no patience for nerves, tugged the wedding gown into place around her. You have grown thicker in the middle since last week, my lady, Madame Perrault said around the pins, not unkindly, simply as fact, the way a woman states the weather. We will need to let the waist. Josephine's whole body went cold. I have been eating poorly with the wedding nerves, she said too quickly. It will pass. Madame Perrault said nothing further, but her eyes, sharp, assessing, the eyes of a woman who had dressed brides for 20 years and buried 2 husbands and knew precisely what a thickened waist and a green complexion and a bride who flinched from her own reflection usually meant, lingered a moment too long on Josephine's midsection before she returned silent to her pins. Josephine did not sleep that night. She lay in the vast unfamiliar bed of the room she'd been given, staring at a ceiling painted with fading cherubs, and understood with a dread that sat like a stone in her throat that the truth she had not told Julian in the study, the truth she had promised herself she would find the courage to speak, tonight after the fitting, could no longer wait for her courage to arrive. It would announce itself with or without her permission in a matter of weeks. Better her voice than a seamstress's whisper carried below stairs to the housekeeper, and from the housekeeper to God knew where. She found Julian in the library near midnight, still awake, a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow, a letter. She recognized the hand, it was the Lisbon solicitor's again, open on the desk before him. You did not come after the fitting, he said without looking up. I could not find the words. And have you found them now? She had rehearsed this 100 times walking the corridor. Every rehearsal had died somewhere between her chest and her tongue. What came out instead was simpler and worse than anything she'd practiced. I am with child. The silence that followed had weight. She watched it settle over him, watched his shoulders go rigid, watched the color leave his face by degrees, watched something in his eyes that had begun, however cautiously, to soften toward her in the study that afternoon, harden instead into something closer to stone. I see. 2 words. Ice in them. Julian. Do not. He stood so quickly the chair scraped hard against the floor. You confessed one deception to me not 6 hours ago and I, fool that I am, sat with you in this house and felt something almost like sympathy. And now you tell me you carry another man's child into my house, into my name, into a wedding not 4 days hence. It is not what else am I to think? His voice had risen now, the first time she had heard it do so. You are not who you claimed. You are not chaste as you claimed. Was any part of you real, Josephine? Or has this entire courtship been built to secure a child, a fortune, and a name to hide behind? The accusation struck her harder than any blow Lord Ambrose had ever dealt her, because this one came wrapped in something that had, for one brief unbearable moment that afternoon, felt like the beginning of care. She had let herself want it. That was her true mistake. You think I chose this? Her voice shook, but it did not break. Something in her had gone past breaking, into a plain, flat kind of grief that had no more tears left to spend. You think I lay with some man for sport and came here to trap a duke into raising the consequence? Then tell me otherwise. He rounded the desk toward her, and for the first time she saw not the composed nobleman but a man genuinely, dangerously stripped of his careful control. Tell me the truth if you have any left in you to give. And so, in the dim gutter light of a dying fire, she told him the second truth, the one she had buried even deeper than the first, the one she had not spoken aloud to a living soul since it happened. She told him of Lord Ambrose Vane's carriage on a wet October night 11 months past. Of how she had trusted him only so far as any companion trusts a peer's escort home. Of how trust had not mattered. Of how she had told no one because no one would have weighed her word against an earl's sons, and had instead done the only thing a ruined, penniless woman with no protector could do. She had disappeared into a dead girl's name and prayed the sea between them would be wide enough. Julian did not move for a long moment after she finished. The fire popped low in the grate. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck the half-hour, indifferent to the ruin being sorted through in this one small room. Ambrose Vane, he said at last very quietly, and something in the way he said the name, flat, controlled, dangerous, told her he knew the man or knew of him or both. You believe me? She asked, and hated how small her voice had gone, how much like the frightened companion she'd once been and had sworn never to sound like again. He did not answer that directly. Instead he crossed to the window, hands braced against the frame exactly as he had that afternoon, and stared out into a garden gone black with night. I do not know yet what I believe, he said. I know only that 4 days from now, half of London expects to watch me marry a woman who does not exist, carrying a child that is not mine, and that whatever I decide in these next 4 days will follow us both to our graves. He turned back to her then, and in the low firelight his face was unreadable, not cruel, not yet forgiving, caught somewhere in the narrow country between the two. Go to bed, Josephine, he said. I have thinking to do that is better done alone. She left him there, the letter still open on his desk, the brandy still untouched, and understood, walking the cold corridor back to her borrowed room, that her fate now rested entirely in the hands of a man she had lied to, wronged, and, God help her, begun despite everything to love. Chapter 4. He did not send for her the next morning. Nor the one after. 2 days passed in a silence so complete that Josephine began to wonder if he intended simply to let the wedding collapse under its own weight, to say nothing, do nothing, and allow the whole arrangement to quietly dissolve before it could be spoken of in drawing rooms across the city. She took her meals alone. She did not go near the fitting room. Madame Perrot's half-finished gown hung on its form like an accusation nobody dared voice aloud. It was Peg, of all people, who broke the silence, arriving breathless at Josephine's door on the 3rd morning with a folded note and eyes wide with something between fear and excitement. His Grace rode out at dawn, Peg said. Took only Hodges with him. Didn't say where. Mrs. Firth says he hasn't ridden out like that. Sudden, no warning, since his brother's affairs, God rest him. Josephine unfolded the note with hands that would not quite steady. I have gone to see a man about a debt he does not know he owes. Do not leave the house. Do not speak to anyone of what passed between us. Trust me in this, if in nothing else. J.A. She did not understand it until nearly evening, when the sound of hooves on gravel brought her to the window, and she watched Julian dismount in the blue dusk, his coat torn at one shoulder, a bruise already purpling along his jaw, his knuckles wrapped in a handkerchief gone dark and stiff. Whatever had happened, It had not been a conversation conducted over tea. He sent for her an hour later, once he had washed and changed, though the bruise he made no effort to hide. "You went to him," she said, the moment the study door closed behind her. Her voice was not steady. "You went to Ambrose Vane." "I went to ask him a question," Julian said, and he was foolish enough to answer it with his fists rather than his tongue, which told me everything his tongue would have denied. He said it almost lightly, but his eyes when they found hers were not light at all. "He is not a subtle man, Josephine. Men rarely are when they believe themselves untouchable. You could have been killed. Or ruined. A duke brawling with an earl's son over the truth," he finished, "which I find I have grown rather attached to of late, having been so recently deprived of it." He crossed to where she stood, close enough now that she had to tilt her chin to hold his gaze. "I did not go seeking a confession for my own satisfaction. I went because I needed, for my own conscience, to know whether the man you named would flinch at the accusation, or laugh at it as though it cost him nothing." He did not laugh, Josephine. He turned the color of old milk and reached for his letter opener before he ever reached for words. Something in her chest, wound tight for 11 months, loosened by one single painful degree. "Then you believe me." "I believed you 3 nights ago," he said quietly. "I went to Vane's house to believe myself." He moved to the desk and withdrew a second letter. Not the solicitor's this time, but one bearing his own seal, already sanded and sealed, waiting. "I have spent 2 days deciding what a man does with a truth like this," he said. "I could expose you. Half of London would call it justice. The impostor unmasked, the wedding cancelled, the scandal delicious enough to survive a full season. You would be ruined beyond any hope of recovery, and the child would carry that ruin from its very first breath, through no fault of its own. That is one road." Josephine said nothing. Her throat had closed too tightly to permit it. "Or," he continued, "I could quietly withdraw. Pay whatever was necessary to see you settled somewhere far from London, somewhere your name, whatever name you chose to wear there, need never touch mine again. That is the second road. The safer one for a duke with a family name to protect. And the third." He looked at her for a long moment before he answered. And in that silence she watched something settle in him. A decision arrived at not in a single instant, she understood, but built slowly over 2 sleepless days and 1 bruising, bloody confrontation in another man's drawing room. "The third road," he said, "is that I marry you as planned. That the child, when it comes, is registered as mine, under my name with my signature, and no soul beyond the 4 walls of this house, not Vane, not the solicitor, not God himself, ever hears otherwise from my lips. That we bury Josephine Hale and Lady Alara Fenwick both, quietly, and build something new out of the wreckage neither of us chose." "Why?" The word came out of her raw, disbelieving. "Why would you take on a lie greater than the one I told you, to protect a woman who deceived you and a child that isn't yours?" He reached for her hand then, not tentative this time, not asking permission at the edge of her jaw, but simply taking it, folding it into both of his own as though it were something he intended to keep. "Because I have spent 11 years since my brother died playing the role every duke is meant to play," he said, correct, controlled, entirely alone, "and in 1 fortnight of lies and confessions, you have made me feel more than I have felt in all that time put together. I am not offering you rescue, Josephine. I am not fool enough to think you need rescuing. I am offering you a choice. The same choice you were denied the night Ambrose Vane decided your consent was his to ignore. Marry me because you wish to. Or tell me no, and I will still see you and the child safe, and ask nothing further of you as long as I live." The fire had burned low. Somewhere beyond the window the city went on being itself. Indifferent, ignorant, unaware that in one quiet study a duke had just handed a ruined woman the one thing she had never once, in 11 months of running, believed she would be offered again. Her answer when it came was not a word at all. It was her hand tightening around his, her forehead dropping against his chest, and the first tears she had allowed herself since Lisbon finally falling. Chapter 5. The wedding took place on a Thursday under a sky washed clean by a night of rain, and if the guests noticed that the bride was thinner in the face and fuller in the waist than fashion strictly allowed, London's better families were far too well-bred to remark upon it aloud. Gossip, Josephine had learned, moved slower when the man at its center gave it nothing to feed on. She stood once more before St. Aldrich's altar, a different church than the one in her nightmares, though her heart beat with the same old terror as she walked toward it. Only this time the fear was not of the man waiting for her. Julian stood beneath the arch with the bruise on his jaw faded to a pale shadow, his coat immaculate, his eyes finding hers the moment she appeared at the far doors and never once leaving her face for the whole long walk down the aisle. There was no whispering behind fans this time that she could hear, or if there was, she had stopped listening for it. She had spent 11 months listening for judgment in every rustle of silk. She found, walking toward him, that she no longer needed to. Peg had done her hair that morning with hands that trembled with something closer to joy than nerves, tucking a single sprig of white heather behind her ear. "For luck, my lady, though I dare say you've made your own." Madame Perrault, informed at last of the truth by a conversation Josephine still did not know the particulars of, had let out the waist of the gown without a single word of judgment, only a Frenchwoman's brisk efficiency and, at the final fitting, an unexpected press of her weathered hand over Josephine's. "Courage," she had said. Nothing more. It had been enough. The vows themselves felt strange in Josephine's mouth, not because they were false but because for the first time in nearly a year, every word she spoke was entirely true. "I, Josephine," she had insisted upon that quietly to the vicar beforehand, and Julian had not argued. "Take thee, Julian." Not Alara. Never again Alara. She was burying that borrowed name today alongside every lie it had ever required her to tell, and the vicar, bribed or persuaded or simply kind, asked no questions about the discrepancy in the parish register. When Julian slid the ring onto her finger, his hands were not quite steady, and she found she loved him a little more for that. This careful, contained man who commanded rooms without raising his voice, undone by something as small as a gold band, and a woman who had cost him nearly everything he thought he valued. "You may kiss your bride," the vicar said. Julian did not rush it. He cupped her jaw the way he had that first afternoon in his study, asking without asking, though this time there was no dressmaker's footsteps to interrupt them, no lie left folded between their bodies to keep them apart. His thumb traced the line of her cheek, slow as though memorizing it, and Josephine felt the whole cathedral fall away, the guests, the whispers, the 11 months of fear, until there was only the warmth of his breath a heartbeat from hers, the scar through his eyebrow close enough to touch, and the long aching stillness of two people who had earned at terrible cost the right to finally stop pretending. When his lips met hers, it was not the desperate kiss of a man claiming what was owed him. It was slow, deliberate, a question answered rather than asked, his hand sliding to rest so lightly it might have been an accident, against the small curve where their child was growing, as if to say, "Both of you I choose. Both of you I keep." Josephine felt that touch travel through her like warmth spreading from a struck match, and when they finally parted, neither of them in any hurry to, there were tears on her face she made no effort to hide. The child came in the spring. A daughter, small and furious, lunged with her mother's fair hair, and to the quiet astonishment of the household, her father's stubborn slate-gray eyes, though whose blood ran in her veins, remained a secret held inside four walls and never spoken past them. Julian held her the first night as though she were made of something more fragile than porcelain, and when Mrs. Firth asked carefully what name they'd chosen, he answered without hesitation. "Grace," he said, "for the thing neither of us expected to be given, and both of us needed most." Josephine, watching him from the bed, her body still weak, her heart entirely undone, thought of Lisbon, of the fever, the borrowed name, the 11 months of running from a truth she had believed would destroy her the moment it was spoken. She thought of how very wrong she had been. The truth had not destroyed her. It had in the end been the only thing that ever truly set her free. Ravenska Hall, once a house of correct silences and careful distances, filled that year with a sound it had not known in a decade. Laughter, real and unguarded, echoing down corridors that had forgotten what it was for. And somewhere beneath it all, quiet as a held breath, a duke and a woman who had once worn a dead girl's name went on choosing each other, morning after morning, in all the small, ordinary, unremarkable ways that no gossip in London ever thought to whisper about, because it was never scandal that lasted. It was only ever this. If this story moved you, let us know where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe to Charlotte's Title Whispers so you never miss the next tale of love, secrets and second chances.